Welcome back. This is part 2 of Key Issue 3 on agriculture. Where is agriculture distributed? And I don't love that title so much. That is that is just the title your book gives, but it's really where are the different types of agriculture distributed? We looked in the last lecture in Key Issue 3 lecture, part 1, at different types of agriculture that we predominantly see in the developing world. Now we're looking at agriculture that we see in the developed world. And the first one up today is commercial gardening and fruit farming. This is the predominant type of farming in southeastern United States and California. It's commonly referred to as truck farming, from the Middle English word truck, meaning bartering or exchange of commodities. So I don't want you to get confused here and picture, somebody's pickup truck and they're selling cantaloupes out of the back of it. We do get to see that, fortunately, because we have some great local farmers. But really, truck farming, I want you to picture a big semi-truck filled with food, because this is large-scale farming of perishable products. Truck farmers grow many of the following fruits and vegetables that consumers in developed countries demand, like apples, asparagus, cherries, lettuce, tomatoes, potatoes. The list could go on and on and on, but it's usually foods that are pretty perishable, foods that we might take them for granted, but if you were to live in another country, you would definitely not get to have them every meal. It'd be kind of a special thing. Here's an example of a large truck farm. Those are tomatoes, and I just think this is so cool. You can look up videos of this, of a tomato harvester, because it can just efficiently collect so many tomatoes at once. In fact, in the United States and in Europe, we've gotten so good at growing tomatoes that we every year have an overabundance of tomatoes. And there are several tomato festivals where it looks like fun and a lot of mess. You donate money to some charity and you get a ticket to join the big tomato fight. I think they do one in Las Vegas here. And one of these pictures is from Spain as well, maybe both of them. Okay, a little bit more about truck farming. Again, this one is also known as commercial gardening and fruit farming. Some of the fruits and vegetables are sold fresh to consumers, but most are sold to large processors for canning or freezing, or making other products. Think about how much ketchup there is in this country. That has to come from tomatoes and other ingredients. Truck farms are highly efficient, large-scale operations that take full advantage of machines at all stages of the growing process, as well as you saw in the last picture, the harvesting process. Labor costs are kept down by hiring migrant farm workers. So this would be an interesting thing to talk about when you're reviewing, or to consider when you're reviewing immigration. When we think about short-term migrant workers, a lot of these farms in the Southeast and in California, they employ Mexican immigrants. Specialization in a few crops is common. Why? Well, think about that tomato harvester. That machine is designed specifically to harvest tomatoes, so it's going to be most beneficial to focus on one crop or a couple crops, because you have the technology to grow that crop and to harvest that crop. I don't want to be misleading, though, in getting you to think that most farmers own all that technology. Actually, most farmers pay harvesting companies to come in with those $1 million machines and harvest the food for them. This is from California. These are almond trees. I just think they're beautiful. And California has a great environment for growing all these different types of foods, from vegetables to fruits to nuts. Unfortunately, the one thing California doesn't really have is water. So it has to divert water. A lot of it comes from the Colorado River, and this is constantly a point of concern for California and environmentalists, because you have a region that's great for growing food except doesn't have enough water, and a lot of questions about whether or not it's the right to bring in that much water and prevent it from going elsewhere do come up. But we may see in the future, as global warming probably will continue, California not being as great a location simply because of the lack of water. There have been droughts in the past. Right now things are okay, but we can assume that those droughts will come back. Anyway, it is interesting to me to think about people drinking almond milk. And maybe some of y'all enjoy almond milk. I think it tastes fine. And certainly people who are lactose intolerant or just don't want to drink cow milk, it's a good alternative. But what a lot of resources must go into that. Almond milk is actually probably one of the worst products for the environment as far as what you get. I'm not trying to guilt trip you into stop drinking almond milk. It's just fascinating. Okay, now the next type of farming would be grain farming. This is distinguished from mixed crop and livestock farming. Remember that one? That was the one where you've got a farm that has, or you're raising animals and you're growing food, and a lot of that food is to feed the animals. But this one's different because crops are grown primarily for human consumption. Farms sell their output to manufacturers of food products, such as breakfast cereals and bread. Some of the characteristics of a typical grain farm. Heavily mechanized. That means they use machinery in every stage of the food growing and harvesting process. Farms are large in areal extent. Just means big farms. And they're oriented to consumer preferences. Meaning the way that they grow, the kind of crops that they grow, and the strains of the crops that they continue to produce are really going to be focused on what the consumer wants and what the consumer is buying. And trends change as far as what consumers want to eat. You know, we're kind of moving, I shouldn't say we're moving away from wheat, but a lot of people don't want to eat wheat, so they want to have wheat alternatives. And so that's going to impact the kind of grains that are grown. Next up is Mediterranean agriculture. And as you could probably guess, we see this predominantly along the Mediterranean Ocean. I should say the Mediterranean Sea, not ocean. But there are a lot of other places that actually can practice Mediterranean agriculture because it's more about the environment than just one location. Every site practicing this form of agriculture borders the sea, and most are on the west coast of continents. So California, the California coast, even Oregon, you can practice Mediterranean agriculture there. There's prevailing sea winds that provide moisture and moderate the winter temperatures. Great thing about the west coast, and the east coast is not quite like this. The Gulf is kind of like this, but the great thing about the west coast is that wind coming off of the ocean brings warm temperature, so it never gets too extremely cold or too extremely hot. Farmers derive a smaller percentage of income from animal products, so they don't do as much animal rearing, but also not as much dairy or things like egg harvesting from chickens. Most crops are grown for human consumption. Horticulture, which is the growing of fruits, vegetables, and flowers, and tree crops form the commercial base, meaning this is the majority of Mediterranean agriculture. Along the Mediterranean Sea, olives and grapes are the two most important cash crops. Remember, a cash crop is something you can produce a lot of, and you can export it and sell it across the world. Approximately half of the land here is used to grow cereals as well. And here we have a nice little Mediterranean farm in Italy. Of course, with all those grapes, a lot of it is going to go to producing wine. And I just thought this was an interesting map. Of course, we know a lot of wine comes from the Mediterranean, specifically Italy and France and Spain. And you probably know a lot of wine is grown in California on the West Coast, also in South America. Argentina produces a lot, Australia produces a lot, and South Africa produces a lot. Germany, even though it's not really a Mediterranean country, it's able to produce a good amount of wine. But the surprising thing to me has been China, and China's become one of the largest producers and consumers of wine. And it just does, I don't know, for some reason it doesn't seem like they would be. But that goes to show you that you can't make assumptions about where certain trends are going to take place. China doesn't have a very long history of wine production like, say, France does, but it is producing a lot. And if you look at the map, you see it's really at a similar latitude as the United States and those Mediterranean countries. And so it shouldn't be surprising that they're able to grow grapes. Last one we'll look at, livestock ranching. Ranching is the commercial grazing of livestock over an extensive area. That means over a sprawling, large area. It's well suited for semi-arid or arid land. Why is that? Well, it's not necessarily that the arid land or the semi-arid land is better for raising livestock like cattle than any other place. It's just that it's not good for any other type of agriculture. If you can grow grass, then you can raise cattle. But if all you can grow is some grass, you can't do trees, you can't do grain very well, you can't do fruits and vegetables, then might as well raise some cattle there. And that's why we think of the American Southwest as this hub of cattle grazing, as it predominantly used to be. And we think about cowboys and moving the herd across the open land. Those days, of course, are long gone and have been replaced by large feedlots. Livestock ranching is practiced in developed countries where vegetation is too sparse and soil too poor to support crops. Historically, ranchers sought to move their cattle from Texas to Chicago because the cattle were worth more money farther north. Today, ranching has become part of the meat processing industry, where new methods of breeding and sources of water and feed are embraced. And I alluded to that a few seconds ago. The change is that, of course, we don't have cowboys moving. There are still cowboys, but they're not moving cattle across the American Southwest. They're not, herding them up to the railroads and meatpacking plants of Chicago. Instead, it's more localized. Often cattle will be raised on a large open area where they can graze, but then they will be sent to a facility which is called a feedlot, where essentially they're fed grain to fatten them up, and then once they get fat enough, then they are taken to or led into the facility where they're slaughtered and then processed. So I won't force you to watch a video on that, but they are out there if you're interested. Uh, if you eat meat, I think it's worth knowing how it gets on your plate and where it actually comes from. If you don't eat meat, then you don't have to worry about that. Here's a picture of modern day cowboys. Like I said, they do still move them about and graze on large areas of land. They just don't move them across country as much. But this is the historic, traditional path that cattle would be led on up to the railroad, and then from that railroad put onto cars and taken to Chicago. This shows meat production in million metric tons with a number of primary types of meat that are produced. You see a lot of sheep in Australia. Sheep outnumber humans in Australia, I think about 5 to 1. Don't quote me on that. You can look it up because it may have changed. But last time I checked, about 5 to 1. And in New Zealand, I think even higher than that. But we see a lot of cattle production throughout different regions. Of course, we got to keep in mind that the environment is going to play a role in the type of animals that are going to be raised. Cattle production has increased dramatically in South America, not necessarily because there's a lot of open, arid places to raise them, but because people like beef. And we've actually seen, unfortunately, a lot of the Amazon rainforest in Brazil being cut down in order to open up land for cattle to be raised, for cattle to graze.